Hello and welcome to Streamers and Punches, the podcast from Sound Notion TV that looks at current events and new releases in the world of film music. My name is Bill Witham.
And I'm Kevin Wilt.
And on today's show, we're going to be looking at a couple of headlines, a couple of thoughts about some recent scores we've heard, and just a discussion about an interesting phenomenon that occurred with a new movie that just opened this past weekend. So first off, John Williams' birthday is coming up, and one sort of odd way we've chose to celebrate it is finding an interesting, I would say, maybe a cover of the theme to Jurassic Park. Either way you want to describe it, it's kind of a cute, charming video. Then normally we don't play videos from YouTube, but this one did stand out. Of course, well, we did play that dog one, I think, a few weeks ago. So there's that. But we'll come back a little later and play a little excerpt from this. In other news, Back to the Future. If we have fans who like it, if we have fans who don't like it, either way, it's definitely a cultural phenomenon as far as movies go, and there's still a pretty strong following for it. There was a recent talk about a possible Broadway show. Even talk so much as that Bob Zemeckis, the director of it, and Alan Silvestri, the composer, and I believe Bob Gale, one of the creators and producers of the original trilogy, were all talking about possibly producing a Broadway show with songs and everything based completely off the film with the original composer on board. Kevin, you said you had a chance to check this out?
Yeah, I've seen this news story pop up in a couple of other places over the past few days. I've also seen conflicting things. I think I ran across a quote from Bob Gale in one place or another saying, don't read all this stuff online saying there's going to be a Broadway show, but who knows? It seems like it's still very early on. I mean, it would kind of make sense. It seems that this trend or affliction or whatever you want to call it that's been happening with movies over maybe 10, 15 years of. It seems like every movie made nowadays has to be something from a pre-existing license. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be a trend that has been happening on Broadway the past couple of years. Because now, you've got, of course, Spider-Man the musical, but you've got a musical based on Moving Out, a bunch of songs by Billy Joel, so those are all pre-existing things with a pre-existing name. You've got a musical based on songs by Green Day, so it seems like all of these big-budget musicals have to have kind of this pre-existing license, like a lot of these summer blockbuster movies have to. Mm-hmm. And Back to the Future as a license for a musical, I suppose, would be just as good as any. I mean, it's a very famous film score, and there's a lot of things you can do with Huey Lewis and kind of the 1950s early rock and roll from the prom dance and all that kind of stuff. So I could see how it would have some potential as a musical. I guess we'll see if it happens, but it's an interesting idea, I suppose.
Well, this is kind of a larger topic. I might want to come back to this in just a couple minutes. I do want to go ahead and just sort of finish out the headlines. So I mentioned John Williams is going to turn 80. His birthday is Wednesday, February 8th. My bad. So happy birthday, John Williams. He's now at 8 decades old. It's pretty serious. So anyway, next up, new score CDs coming out. Randy Newman's Toy Story 3 has just come out. You can pick this up at screenarchives.com, also intrada.com. Also, 2 scores by Lee Holdridge. He's a composer. I haven't seen him in recent years do a whole lot, but I would say through the late 70s and 80s, and I think a little bit into the 90s, he was pretty active. Had a large sound, kind of like Basil Polidorus, usually very good melodic theme writer, and I think Beastmaster was probably the most well-known score of his that I was familiar with. But he's got a couple scores, one called Walking with Destiny, a second called I Have Never Forgotten You, and those two, along with Toy Story 3, have just come out in the last couple weeks. And the Toy Story 3 is of note or worth noting just because Disney has only recently started releasing its orchestral scores, starting with a couple of Michael Giacchino scores for Up and and well, that may be the only one I can think of off the top of my head. Of course, John Barry's score for The Black Hole, which has been a fan favorite for decades, has also recently been released as well. So Disney is now starting to be actually friendly towards its score collectors. So definitely, if there's any fans of these, pick them up, because I think it'll have a positive impact on any good scores in the future that we would be waiting on from Disney to be released. So that'd be pretty important. Well, let's come back to the Broadway thing. Just to join in on this, I remember there's a new movie that was just made, and I can't remember. It's the one about the hair bands from the 80s, and it's got basically like a young guy and a young girl, and they're sort of trying to go. I guess they're going to Los Angeles in the middle of the 80s, and Tom Cruise is going to star as the main sort of.
Oh yeah. I remember seeing a trailer for that movie, and I can't for the life of me remember.
I think it's Rock of Ages.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So that's another one where the whole scheme or the whole basic plot was created around the songs. So every song is basically a top 40 hit, and it's all popular. So it's just brought in, and then they sort of thread it together with some kind of story. So it's like in all the mediums these days, whether it be film or Broadway or I guess television too, they're going for some kind of familiarity to sort of cut through all of the, the chance that it might be new and you might not know it, and therefore you might be a little bit reluctant to go see something new. This kind of gets rid of that and kind of walks your hand through it, which is good and bad, because it's good that you know what you're getting into and that it might not be a complete waste of time. But it's also bad because it's not very creative, original, or interesting. Because
and some of the most interesting things are the things you're unfamiliar with. I mean, kind of the big counter example to this trend is Inception. There was no pre-existing anything for that. It was a completely new idea. But because it was interesting and really good, it made $1 bazillion,
Right, and the movie studios are not talking about that.
Right, and I mean, I guess you can kind of sympathize, because if I'm going to drop $200 million to make a movie, that's a big enough chance without having some kind of insurance that at least people will be tempted to go see it because they'll know something about it ahead of time. I mean, I can see that perspective. I still don't know it's the best solution, but. Because then you end up with movies like Battleship that's going to come up pretty soon, which looks terrible.
Right. I mean, well, to address the board game syndrome that's been happening, I just read that Candyland is not going to actually be turned into a film by the guys who were going to turn it into a film after all. And hold off on your celebrating, because even though that itself is good news, then Adam Sandler's production company got a hold of it. So
good Lord.
God knows what they're going to come up with Candyland. But besides film and Broadway, even operas are subject to this as well, because there was a Little Women movie. There was a Brokeback Mountain. I'm sorry, a Little Women, of course, was in a film, but in its original form, of course, it's a novel. But there was a Little Women opera that was written not that long ago. There was also recently Brokeback Mountain. And although some of the other titles are escaping my mind at the moment, some of them will have some element that's familiar, like Elliot Goldenthal's Grendel is basically the Beowulf legend told, but from the viewpoint of Grendel. And so it's sort of a twist on the familiar epic poem. So even opera, in some sense, is not able to escape it and has to embrace some kind of familiarity, and I guess in just an effort to stay alive. So it's kind of interesting to see this permeate through all these different kinds of arts or cultural categories. To see what everyone's having to do to survive. So it's interesting. The next thing we wanted to discuss is kind of a weird phenomenon. Every now and then there will be a movie that's created and it has no score. There's no music written for it. And sometimes that lends a very, very, very realistic feel to the film. But since this is a podcast that does deal with film music, I just thought it'd be interesting to talk about a movie that came out this weekend. It's called Chronicle, and it basically details three teenagers who stumble upon a sort of alien spacecraft, or I don't think it's very clearly explained what it is, but they receive powers from it, and then from there on, the story details how they come to terms with their abilities and everything else. But the overriding style for the film is what they call found footage, where it looks as though everything's being filmed by someone holding the camera. So if you recall Cloverfield from a few years ago, or I guess even before that, maybe the Blair Witch Project.
Blair Witch Project, or the Paranormal Activity movies, I think are all in that same style.
Yeah. They have kind of like a stationary camera, but it's still kind of the same, like phony realism kind of approach.
Right,
like it's
almost as if it's like a security camera or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
That you're aware that the camera is within the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so and I just wanted to read the IMDb summary. Just to keep myself honest. 3 high school friends gain superpowers after making an incredible discovery. Soon, though, they find their lives spinning out of control and their bond tested as they embrace their darker sides. So it's exploring some areas that are getting into a little more human nature than maybe Captain America did, for example, or Thor. But that's okay, because these aren't really comic book characters. But I do think it's kind of fascinating that they don't have any score at all. And even though there's a found footage element to it, I guess at this point that just means automatically no music if you're going to go with found footage, because that would instantly take the viewer out of the film. But it also makes me wonder if since the going trend is to make all movies more realistic, even the Christopher Nolan Batman movies are trying to be more realistic as superhero films, even though that's almost like an oxymoron kind of a thing to do. It makes me wonder if the overall trend is just going more and more towards less and less score, to the point where movies just might not even have it at all, and the idea of music will be an antiquated concept and only used for montages and transitions.
I think it's certainly a cyclical thing. I mean, pardon me. I mean, you look back towards, especially again, like the 1960s, where you have scores that are more popular music based, where it's you like The Graduate or something, where it's basically scored with a few songs. Or you look at something like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where it's the same thing, just a couple of Burt Bacharach songs in there, and really no other underscore. It's I think you have trends like that kind of come and go. I would be surprised if this is more than a cyclical type of move. And it's funny you mentioned that for these found footage types of films, that having a score would kind of detract from the realism. But here with Chronicle, we're talking about a superhero movie. I mean, I think I saw in the trailer a guy throwing a bus. I mean, I'm pretty sure realism isn't really a part of a guy throwing a bus. It kind of goes back to that old story. Sometimes you hear it between. I've heard it told between Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann, and sometimes I've heard it involving Alfred Newman, where Hitchcock is shooting a scene, or has shot a scene with a bunch of survivors in a life raft out in the ocean, and they're talking about scoring the scene, and Hitchcock says, they're out in the middle of the ocean. Well, tell me where is the orchestra in that case? It's not very realistic. And whether it's Bernard Herrmann or Alfred Newman, he says, you tell me where the cameras are, I'll tell you where the orchestra is. So I understand the argument that for ultimate realism, you don't music gets rid of that. But I think there are plenty of realistic films that have music. I don't think music necessarily detracts from the realism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's right. Dave was telling us that the Good Night and Good Luck, which is a George Clooney film from a couple years ago about, I think it was Edward R. Murrow, right?
Yep.
The newscaster, has a few jazz source cues, but not really any direct underscore. And I actually think
the impressive thing about the source music in that film is not only is it source music with the live musicians playing. It's not the kind of music where, okay, let's have them go record this in a studio and then they'll pretend like they're singing when we film them. No, they were playing live when they shot the film, and that's that's a lot of pressure. You really got to get it right. So that's
Hmm.
kind of ballsy to do it that way. But I mean, there
Yeah.
certainly are films every once in a while you run into where there's no score, whether it's for realistic purposes or for maybe it's a small film like Blair Witch Project or something where whether they wanted a score or not, maybe there wasn't money for the score. But I think the interesting thing here, and Bill, you kind of mentioned this, it's a superhero movie. We're used to superhero movies with scores as big as their characters, and so here to have this be a superhero movie without a big superhero score, I think is the unusual thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think they go to great lengths throughout the film to make it seem realistic. The found footage, the way the visual effects are worked into it. From the few scenes that I have seen. So as as a disclaimer, I have not seen Chronicle, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on the film itself, and I can't do that without having seen it. But I just thought the
Oh, sure
concept
you can.
itself.
You want to.
What's that?
Said, oh, sure you can. You want to.
No, I
I've
just
seen the
want to bring
trailer,
up
so
the
I know it
idea. I
sucks.
think it's kind of compelling that it almost seems, if you look at certain key movies, and I'll talk about Drive here in just a second, but then we've also mentioned the American remake of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. You look at a certain few of these selected movies along the way, and they seem to almost be little milestones or little touchstones or indicators along the way of a trend or a direction that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm not trying to be bleak, but it seems to be that if you have your next film with a huge score, as much as that might be fun to listen to, fun to write, or get recorded, that might not be actually going in the way film is going. It's just kind of an observation. I'm curious if that's what anyone else thinks. So, for any listeners out there, I'm curious if you've seen something recently that had a big score or not, and what you
Mm-hmm.
noticed about it, and what you actually think might be happening in music. So it is fascinating because more than ever before, we've noticed from small films to large films, music and the composers do seem a lot more expendable, which is kind of dangerous. But
And it's certainly something over the past several months with many of the people we've interviewed. It's, I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the role of the composer and the role of music within film is certainly changing. It may be a cyclical thing, it may be a more permanent thing, but it's definitely not the same as it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Certainly not the same as it was 30 or 40 years ago. Um, and that just seems to be the way things are going. Whether it's good or bad, I mean, who knows? But I think we're past the point of arguing whether or not it is happening. I think it clearly is some sort of
yeah,
change. It's just
yeah,
I
it
don't know
definitely
if
is
the
happening.
nature of the change is completely fleshed out yet.
Yeah. Now, the credits for Chronicle list a music supervisor. So, like I said, I haven't seen the film, but I would assume that means there are songs used in it because a music supervisor would have to be the one who selected those songs and cleared
And
the
then
rights and
license
everything
them and
else.
all that sort of thing. Yeah.
So I'm sure that there's some use of music in the strictest sense of background, source material music, where maybe a character is turning on the radio, or if they're carrying devices with them the whole time, then I'm sure that a character turns a radio on, or a CD player, MP3 player, or whatever,
Mhm.
and then you hear some music of carefully selected songs, and maybe they're even used in a filmic way or cinematic way, like a montage or a transition. But it seems that there's nothing in the way of score used. So I may have to see Chronicle. It just depends on my schedule, but I can tell you for another movie, like I mentioned, The Gray last week, that actually it was a very light score, but it was there the entire time, and it did what scores sort of traditionally do. So as a counter, that was a movie that I thought was incredibly relevant, and it's using all the tricks of modern day filmmaking, and it was very well made, and it was using score just as much as any other film that has a large score. So maybe I'm just sort of reading into it too much, but it's just something to think about. It's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, a couple things we've been listening to this week. I had a chance to check out the score to Drive by Cliff Martinez. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, and just kind of give a few thoughts on it. I've got the movie queued on my Netflix, so I'm sort of waiting. And I was really bummed last week because there was a local film, like a film club that plays sort of art house movies, and they play at one time. That's it, like one night, one time only. And I had it kind of in my calendar to go see Drive, and I was out with some friends, and I missed it, so I didn't get a chance to see it in the theater. But it should be, hopefully, if Netflix fulfills their end of the bargain, I should be getting it soon. The score on its own, although I kept reading that it's very 80s like or uses a lot of synthesizers and sort of pads of sound, it does. I mean, that very much describes it. Sort of very slow moving harmonies and sort of synthetic sound layers. I don't know that I kind of felt that just made it 80s automatically. It just kind of sounded like someone right now using a lot of sounds and a lot of pads. But I suppose there's connection to various 80s movies. I know the Tangerine Dream had a hand in a few, like Risky Business and let's see, the first American version of Legend, and there was a very synthy kind of lots and lots of sort of washed out chords. There was that kind of approach in the 80s, so it's there. But it's very much in the background. So I could lump in Drive with the previous topic as far as music that does so little that it almost does nothing at all, except just provide a kind of a warm cushion of some kind of aural sonicness in the background to let you know that you're watching something that's not quite realistic, but that you should still pay attention because the characters are important and the story is unfolding. But but it was okay. It was kind of sparse again, which is something I also noted about the Dragon Tattoo score by Trent Reznor. So interesting.
And certainly, I think both of those scores are certainly, going back to our previous discussion, talking about scores that are kind of on the new edge or the new way of doing things or the newer role of music in film, I think those two are probably two that would be near the top of the list in terms of illustrating that phenomenon.
Yeah. And you could also lump in the Social Network score into that as well, because that would fit nicely with that same kind of aesthetic. But anyway, I have yet to see the film, and that's where I will make the final judgment. But the score, the sounds were nice, but that's kind of to the extent of what I recognized it as. So it was a score full of nice sounds. And it really doesn't do that much more than that, but it's really moody. So if you like to put it on the background, it could actually definitely set a mood, and that's for sure. Had a few songs before it that also kind of did the same thing. So very kind of laid back and kind of washed out, kind of an overall atmosphere to it. So anyway, that was Drive. But like I said, I'll go check the movie out as soon as I get it from Netflix and make a final assessment there. So anyway, Kevin, anything else you want to mention?
Nope, I think I'm good.
Okay. All right. As I mentioned before, John Williams has his birthday on Wednesday, and we found a fantastic clip of a young man who creates an alternative version of the theme to Jurassic Park. And I say theme, but it's actually several themes. So I just want to give a quick shout out to
a suite of sorts, I guess.
It is kind of like a little suite. I just want to give a quick shout to Ty Forker for turning me onto this clip because it's very funny. And if you have a chance, check out. We'll have it linked on our website, and we'll play a little bit of it after we close out for today. So that will do it for this episode of Streamers and Punches. You can listen to us on soundnotion.tv/SAP, where you can subscribe to our show, leave comments, and find links to the music we spoke about. You can also subscribe to the show through iTunes. My name is Bill Witham.
And I'm Kevin Wilt.
And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
A song, it's the theme tune from a film. It's my favourite film, probably. It's between this and Spider-Man 3. Dinosaurs are in the film. It's a film about dinosaurs. It's called Jurassic Park, even though most of the dinosaurs in it are actually from the Cretaceous period. But it doesn't bother me that there's a few inaccuracies, speaking paleontologically, because I suppose no one really knows all that much about.
When you're ready, sir. Tape has speed.
Yay! There's our chord. Okay. Hello and welcome to Streamers and Punches.